Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar. As most of you know, we have a regular cadence of doing webinars. We hit a certain theme, a certain topic, and we will usually do a series in and around those webinars. So for instance, the one that we're in the middle of every Wednesday has been a follow-on to our global threat report, which we did on July 31st, where we've actually broke down the four major attack buckets: device attacks, network attacks, phishing, and malicious apps. So we're in the middle of that series. This one is out of band. This one is out of band because, as everybody I'm sure that's attending this webinar knows, Google Project Zero made an announcement, disclosure last week about some malicious websites that were delivering iOS exploits. Multiple kill chains were involved. So we thought it would be very helpful to kind of come back and kind of break this down a little bit. It's very easy to get wrapped into the details, especially because Ian Beer and company from Google Project Zero do an excellent job of really breaking everything down. But sometimes if you dive too deep into things too fast, you can definitely miss the infamous forest. So we're going to go through and we're going to run through some of the key points. We're not going to be atrocious about this. We're not going to go into minute levels of detail about certain things. We can do that on blogs. We can do it on one-on-ones. We're going to give you guys the big picture of this whole thing and then kind of go from there. So usual things, I'm going to go about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes of content. Then we'll have questions. If there are no questions at the end, that's fine. We don't make them up. This will be recorded, and if people are interested, we can make slides available. We also have a blog that's up on this, a preliminary blog, and we'll probably be blogging more about it going forward. With that, let us dive straight into the topic. The first thing we think is really important to always tee up is this, and this Google Project Zero scenario has kind of proved this out, but it is now just something that we need to kind of set up right up front. Mobile's an endpoint. A couple years ago, all the mobility security things were being looked at by mobility teams, and the security guys weren't even involved. Last year, it flipped. Now every project, endpoint security is involved. And the reality is, in most enterprises, and that's what Zimperium is designed to fix and to protect, 60% of the endpoints that are now accessing corporate data, accessing corporate networks are mobile. And there's some certain time-tested adages in cybersecurity. We're going to be coming back to another one here in a little bit when we get into the threat chains. But the first one is land and expand. The bad guys are always going to find the weakest link in and then expand from there. And that weak link changes over time. Right? Now, there's no reason for them to try and go directly at a data center, for instance. That doesn't make any sense. What they will do instead is go after mobile devices because the majority of mobile devices have no security on them. There's also the perception that things like the announcement last week are starting to prove false. And we know for a fact, as I'll talk about in the next slide, that things like iOS are bulletproof. iOS has done a great job of vetting apps in the App Store, but that's only one of 4 vectors, and there's multiple ways of being able to attack a device, as last week is demonstrated. So now, it used to be a couple of years ago, point-of-sale terminals were in vogue, especially point-of-sale terminals that were like at remote chains and stuff, because they were less protected than traditional endpoints. Now, you take the single biggest security risk in an organization, that's a human being, a carbon-based life form. You give them a supercomputer, and you make them the admin. And they spend 80% of their time outside of your protected corporate networks deciding what networks to connect to, what websites to connect to, what apps to download, and you have zero control over them. Then they walk right back into the enterprise. So we need to protect mobile as an endpoint. These endpoints are absolutely under attack. I mentioned we know this. The level set is this. We have thousands of customers, tens of millions of endpoints worldwide at Zimperium. 100% of them detect threats. 100% of them detect threats. As soon as they put visibility onto those 60%, once they turn the lights up, then they see all the nastiness that's occurring. So we're not surprised by the Google Project Zero announcement at all. There's things that are interesting about it, just like there's things that were interesting about when Mr. Bezos' phone was attacked. But there's fundamentally, it's just another day for us, to be perfectly honest. I mentioned this. This is kind of I laugh all the time about the fact that once somebody shows you the arrow and the FedEx logo, you can never unsee it, right? Mobile security is commonplace now. Mobile threats are commonplace. Now that you're looking at this, things like last week's announcement, you'll just see them everywhere. So it's important to know there's 4 primary attack vectors, and we're going to get into the chains now, right? There's 4 primary attack vectors. I mentioned one thing a minute ago, and that time-tested security outages. And I said, hey, land and expand is one of them, right? Another is persistence. The bad guys, for as long as they've been bad guys, they have had a business plan. You realize these are bad dudes, but they're smart and they're efficient. And so they want to maximize the return on the investment of compromising a device, and always have been. So when they took over a server, when they took over a laptop, desktop, point of sale, they want to be persistent as long as possible to continue their land and expand side of things. Because of the unique nuances of mobile, which we're going to continue to dive further and further into here in a second, starting with the fact that the kernel is locked down, starting with the fact that all apps are in containers, the endpoint security folks are starting to realize what we were used to, and that's the world I came from, was the traditional EPP side, EDR side. We were used to apps being able to come in and go sideways through other apps to be able to be persistent. Well, on mobile, all apps are in containers. So the only way to actually be persistent is to truly compromise the device, elevate privileges, gain root access, everything on those lines. And that is very much the case in the Google Project Zero scenarios as well. So in mobile, everything comes to the device. And there's, as I mentioned, 4 primary attack vectors, device being one of them. The other 3, network attacks, malicious networks, fake networks, rogue access point, MIDMs. We did a whole webinar on network attacks yesterday. Phishing. Phishing is a major issue, right? 90% of breaches start with some form of a phishing attack, and 2/3 of emails are read on mobile. Plus, there's a whole new set of attack vectors, SMS, messaging, personal emails that come on mobile. We did that a couple weeks ago. And then, of course, there is malicious apps. Malicious apps, all of our studies have shown, are generally designed for fraud as a general rule. And now, each one of those, though, can deliver exploits, which is exactly what we're going to talk about, because that's exactly what the different chains were that Google Project Zero is talking about. So it's important. Point number 1, device attacks are huge. But point number 2, the vast majority of all targeted attacks, and that's what we're here to protect. We're here to protect XYZ company from being attacked on mobile. Start with a network attack. The whole webinar yesterday, you can come back and listen to it. 86% of all attacks in the first half of the year started with a malicious network, a MIDM or rogue access point. That is critical when we start going forward. Okay, so these are the things that we need to kind of think about. It all ultimately comes down to the device. So with that as a setup, now let's get into this specific scenario. Okay, so Google Project Zero came out and they disclosed the following last week, that they'd found a small collection of hacked websites, and this is just baselining, so for everybody's on the same page. Several thousand devices each week actually came to this. So, and they were up there for years. So several thousand, it's actually probably a few 100,000 at this point in time, had actually been exploited. Anybody who hit that site was going to experience the attack chains that were on there based on their individual devices, which I'll talk about here in a quick second. So it was indiscriminate from the standpoint of, if you hit that site, you were going to get it. But the reality is you still got to go to that site. So who was lured to that site? Recently, there's been some information that has come out that I personally have not had a chance to dive into and prove. But obviously, there's been some questions about some folks in some geopolitical issues, and they're believing that some of this, a particular minority group, has been targeted, and they were the ones mostly lured there. So we're going to talk about that in the kill chain, not the specific geopolitical, but the luring part here in a second. 5 different exploit kill chains for iOS. So that's key. There's also some stuff coming out now where there's been some Android variations, but this right now we're talking about last week's disclosure. 14 different flaws, vulnerabilities, 7 of which were in Safari, 5 in the kernel, and 2 in sandbox escapes. They allowed the attackers to gain root access. As I mentioned, now it's a unique type of root access, which we're going to talk about here in a second, because it was still in user space. It wasn't in the kernel, but it had some root access capabilities. And then Apple patched the last one. Most of them were closed already, but they did an out-of-band patch earlier in the year. And I'm going to talk about how many patches Apple did in the first half of the year from our global threat report here in a second. But it closed the last of the vulnerabilities. Now, Google Project Zero has an interesting chart here, and I'm not going to go into all the nuances of it. What you see on the left are the various different devices that are up there. And then going across, there were the various different versions of iOS, and each of the 5 chains, which devices they could hit based on which operating systems were there, and then which ones ended up getting patched and ended up being closed. So you can see all the way to the right-hand side is when, in February with that patch I just mentioned, they closed all of these vulnerabilities. Now, I think it's really, really, really important, and even Google Project Zero said this, that these are ones that have been discovered. These are the ones that have been disclosed. These attacks are going to continue to occur. That there's an old thing, and I don't mean to ever trivialize this, but a guy named Willie Sutton is credited. He was a gangster back in the early 1930s. He was credited when somebody said, "Willie, when are you going to stop robbing banks?" And he said, "When you stop putting money in there," right? Basically. Now, it could be money, it could be geopolitical, but as long as there's motivation, people are still going to continue doing this stuff. And an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. And given the fact that they're in the hands of users, people are going to exploit them whenever they get a chance. So I'm not going to go into every single nuance of the actual kill chains. That would be a way longer webinar. We can actually do that with anybody that really would like to, and we can actually step through it. But again, as I mentioned a minute ago, before diving into all the details of this, let's look at the major links in the exploit chains overall. Because at each link, there's an opportunity for danger, and there's also potentially an opportunity for detection. So let's kind of go through each step of the links here real quick. First one, I mentioned it earlier, the lure, okay? I didn't go to that website. Most people on this call didn't go to that website. Somebody had to tell somebody to go to that website. Now, there might be somebody accidentally stumbled into it, just like somebody accidentally made a left turn and ended up in a bad neighborhood. But again, the bad guys were doing this for a reason. So they most likely lured somebody there. 2 primary ways that you can actually guide people there. One is phishing, obviously. I can phish you to try and get you to go to that site. I can trick you into going to that site, whether it's with an email or whether it's with an SMS text or whatever. I can lure you there literally from a phishing side, right? The other part is network attacks. Like I said, we did the whole webinar yesterday. Steve Flowers and I were talking about it. And we were talking about things like man-in-the-middle attacks, rogue access points. If I control your network, I can send you any place I want. And the minute you go to a web page, even if you thought you were going someplace else, because I control the network and I tell you where you're going to go, the exploit could have been delivered. So the first step of this whole thing has to be luring people there. So if you have the ability to detect network attacks, if you have the ability to detect malicious URLs, then you actually have a chance of stopping this thing before it even started. Now, I mentioned the geopolitical thing. It was interesting yesterday. I was thinking about this last night. One of the pieces in our global threat report is the geographic kind of proximity of where the majority of network attacks occurred. I don't personally think it's a huge coincidence that the majority of the malicious networks, not majority, a huge chunk of the malicious networks that we detected are in the APAC region, which is where these websites were found. Now, we are spending time going back and kind of breaking things apart because we do machine learning-based detection of things. What the huge advantage of doing machine learning-based detection is you detect things before they even have a name. A little bit of a drawback is if something like this comes up, we probably are already stopping these attacks. We've probably already stopped these attacks, but we just don't know the name. So we're going back now and saying, okay, let's go back and look at everything we've already been stopping at these different steps in the chain and see how they map against Google Project Zero. So first thing, you got to lure people, right? Then there's the site itself. Once you hit the site, that is obviously a place where everything starts happening, right? Everything starts delivering. There's technology and there's capabilities that are designed to do nothing but detect, let's say, a malicious website. That's not what we do. We're the mobile guys, right? We're protecting the device, not the site. Other guys can be focused on things like, apparently these were legitimate sites that got hacked. So there's technology that should have been implemented to protect the site itself to make sure that there wasn't anything nefarious going on with the site itself. So first you got to lure somebody there. Then you actually hit the site. Hopefully they can put protection on the site to be able to solve that. Then there's the vulnerabilities themselves. And I showed you earlier in that particular chart that there's all these different devices, all these different OSs. Depending on what the right combination is, that's where these guys would be able to exploit it. So before we actually, so again, definitionally, vulnerability is a hole. An exploit is something that goes through the hole to take advantage of it to compromise the device, right? So knowing that a phone is on a device, whether it's phone or iPhone or iPad, whatever, is on a vulnerable operating system is huge. I mentioned earlier, this is from our global threat report. In the first half, Apple patched 185 CVEs, 60%, or you can see 62%, of which were considered critical by Apple themselves, right? And as you can see, that was a 54% increase over the same time last year. Now, that emergency out-of-band patch is one of these, right? And covered, obviously, probably 12 CVEs, considering the ones we were just talking about, or 14 CVEs, if all 14 were directly relevant to that particular exploit. So knowing which one of your devices is vulnerable and then closing those vulnerabilities is huge from a defense standpoint. So there was the lure, got to get you to the site. Then there was the site. Then it actually delivered basically a malicious app, which in Google Project Zero was calling an implant. And here's the thing. This little dude is nasty. This little dude is nasty. Now, what's interesting is, ironically, some of the protections that Apple has put in place actually makes this very specific part of the kill chain probably the most difficult to detect. So here's, for those of us playing around at home, both iOS and Android apps don't get to play with other apps, okay? Unless they have super privileges, like an MDM, right? But as a general rule, apps don't get to play with other apps. The big difference between iOS and Android, one of the big differences on the device itself, putting aside vetting of the App Store and Google Play, is on Android, any app can see an inventory of all the other apps that are on the device. On iOS, the only app that can do that is one MDM per device. So, ironically, when a malicious app, and our data shows that there's literally 10x the number of malicious apps on Android than there is on iOS, vast majority of those come from third-party app stores, okay? But ironically, when it comes to detecting this part of the iOS exploit kill chain, this is the hardest to do on Apple because Apple won't allow apps to see other apps. On Android, you would be able to see the inventory of these apps and say, hey, that's malicious, like we can do with our version on iOS, on Android. On iOS, instead, the MDM is the only one that can actually pull the inventory off. Then you can do an out-of-band analysis to determine if something's malicious. So this is actually the hardest part. This is the part that actually got a lot of attention, but if you cut it off at the lure, if you cut it off at the website, if you close the vulnerabilities, you would never even have this, right? Now, this is a nasty little dude who's running in user space, was able to create a trusted hash inside of the kernel. So it's not in the kernel, but it became a trusted app that could float around outside of a sandbox. And it could literally take, and there's a great analysis of the implant that Ian did. It shows, messages, camera, contacts, keychain, everything, right? Now, here's the key. That by itself is really nasty. That by itself will continue cruising around, causing chaos. But the minute the phone is rebooted, it's gone. And as I mentioned earlier, what the bad guys really want to do is be persistent. If they take that and then say, you know what, I want to be persistent, they actually have to do some of these things that actually elevate privileges, actually gain true root access, and do things along those lines, which are these device attacks that actually are where you are now persistent and above the containers. So the ultimate goal would actually be to elevate and be persistent. And that is, again, another place where detection would come in. So ultimately, each step of this kill chain provides opportunities and challenges. So this is not intended to be a full product pitch, but it is saying, hey, look, we just talked about this nastiness. How would you do anything about this, right? So quick reminder, everything comes back to compromising the device, ultimate objective. Part 2, 9 times out of 10 for targeted attacks, put aside consumers, because again, we're not focused on protecting consumers directly, where malicious apps by themselves might be the end all be all. We're focused on the enterprise. 9 times out of 10, it starts with a network attack. Said differently, that means 9 times out of 10, the bad guy controls the network. And since the bad guy controls the network, he decides where you go. In the kill chain example, he decided, I'm going to drop you on this malicious website that delivers an exploit. He can also choose where you're not going to go. And one of the main things that they do is, if your detection solution, your mobile threat solution like Zimperium, is doing all its detection in the cloud, the first thing the bad guy does is cut off access to that detection site. So we've always believed in the very beginning, with the bad guy owning the network 9 times out of 10, you have to do all of your detection on device. Gartner and company have caught up to that. You can see here, on-device agent, better likelihood of protection persisting over a compromised network. It's about as strong of a statement as they'll make in a report. You talk to a lot of the reporters, a lot of the analysts, they'll even kind of take it down another step for you. But the point is, you need to do your detection on device. Machine speed attacks need to be dealt with machine speed on device. We have one engine, it's called Z9, and it detects the 4 attack vectors on device, even against unknown attacks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the on-device detection of malicious apps is for Android only. We do machine learning-based detection of malicious apps on iOS, but it's in the cloud. But the other 3, especially in the kill chain we were just talking about, would solve all of these problems. Now, a lot of people ask, some questions about, machine learning-based detection. They're kind of like, look, hang on, explain this. So explain 2 things to me. This is what I've been fielding a lot of questions over the last week. They say, explain 2 things to me. 1, how can you detect something you've never seen before, which is the whole fundamental machine learning question. But then question 2, did you guys already detect this thing that Google Project Zero has been disclosed? And if so, why didn't you say anything about it, right? So let me take both of those apart. But first, let me give you a little bit of an analogy, right? Here's the way I think of machine learning based detection, okay? We're all sitting here, it's a beautiful morning, we're at this beautiful, pristine lake, there isn't a ripple on the lake, we're having our coffee, we're relaxing, we're just enjoying it, right? And then somebody comes and throws a rock in, and it floats down to the bottom. The old way of doing things was to dive in, get that rock, come back up, make a picture of it, say, okay, if anybody sees this rock, we know it's going to make waves. Well, what if somebody throws a box in? If somebody throws a ball in, right? Here's the fundamental point. If you think of, let's say, compromising the device as getting to the bottom of the lake, until somebody creates a new way of getting to the bottom of the lake without creating ripples, we will detect it. Which is why we've detected every single device exploit that has become publicly known since 2014 without an update on the device. Okay? Now, back to my two questions. So, question number one, that is right here. Instead of profiling rocks and boxes and all that stuff, we're detecting it by the ripples. Okay? So that's how we can detect things never been seen before. Question number two, have we actually seen this specific kill chain? And if so, why didn't we say anything about it, right? Simple fact is, we're still in the process of investigating exactly that. Because one of the downsides, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm air quoting because in my mind, it's not that big of a downside initially. One of the downsides of machine learning-based detection is we detect things that don't have a name. So what we're doing now is we're going back and saying, okay, obviously, I mentioned earlier, a huge number of our network attacks occurred in the APAC region, as did a huge number of our system compromises. So we're going to now go, so we know we're stopping these, but they all look alike to us. They're all creating ripples. Our job is to stop them before they do anything. Then we can come back and name them. So that's why we're extremely confident that we've stopped these attacks. We now need to actually go back and say, okay, let's go back and find out how many times we stopped these attacks. And that, again, is the power of machine learning. You can roll our engine out in two ways. If you're trying to protect a device 100% of the time, it's called ZIPS. That's like EPP, Endpoint Protection Platform for mobile. It's what Gartner calls mobile threat defense. If you have a mobile app, we have an SDK. You can drop the protection directly inside of the app. In that case, you're not protecting the device, you're protecting the app and the session the app is having. Simple example, we've got mobile banking customers using Zips to protect their employees and ZApp to protect their mobile banking app. Both of those come into our console. Our console, one of the huge advantages of doing everything on device is our console doesn't have to be locked into one cloud because we're not doing our detection in the cloud. So we're completely cloud agnostic. We're the only guys that are FedRAMP ATO. If you see the little AWS GovCloud down there, we integrate in with the largest set of UEMs. We're the only ones who can handle multiple UEMs in a single console. Z3A is advanced app analysis. These are apps that are perfectly legitimate in your organization, but have huge security and privacy risks. We're doing a webinar on malicious and risky apps next week if you're interested in doing that. And then we provide all that information into whatever SIM you like. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if we have any other questions. And then if not, I will give you the rest of your day back. So I do have one question. And the question says, could an infected device hack my mobile app? How do I protect my users? So good question, and I'm going to answer it, I think, in a little bit of a different way. The simple fact is, if somebody owns the device, they don't have to hack your mobile app. If somebody owns the device, they already own the device. So anything your app is doing, they can see, they can act on. So they wouldn't necessarily have to hack your app, I'm air quoting, and maybe insert something inside of it because they already do that. Now, then the second part of that question was, how do I protect my users? If you're a mobile app user, then what I would suggest is the second solution I talked about there, which is called ZApp, which is in-app protection. Because at least in that case, you put our detection capability inside of your app. At least in that case, you'll know if the device has been compromised, and you can take some other action. So for instance, in a banking scenario, you could basically say, okay, I don't want to, I'm going to make sure that this person cannot actually process this transaction, for instance. So let's see. Another question says, was there a spike in threats from our data? It's hard for us to tell because the data has been increasing so dramatically overall that it's kind of hard. But once we dive into it on a much more narrow geographic basis, then we will let you guys know. Another question. Would you assume that there are more attacks like this that are not detected yet? Absolutely. Matter of fact, Google Project Zero even said that and gave us a very clear play on that. Next question. Does ZApp only protect the mobile banking app or the device as a whole? Great question. ZApp itself is embedded inside of the app, and so it would actually only be active whenever the app is open. So in that case, what it does is Z9 will detect any of those attacks that have occurred. It will hand that information back to the app, obviously all via the SDK, and then the app owner decides what they're going to do with that data. So the ZApp case is predominantly focused on protecting the app itself and not the device. And let's see, another question. Can you go into a bit more detail on how you detect malicious network activity with the iOS sandbox? Doesn't the sandbox limit your ability to inspect MIDM attacks? That is a great question. And by the way, I have your information here. Most of the time, we don't really go into specific details of how we're detecting these activities. A, because of the fact that that would be providing information to the bad guys, and B, obviously competitive IP. But I've got your name, and if you'd like, I'll shoot you an email, and we can actually have an off-band conversation to give you a little bit of a color on that one. So I don't see any more questions. A couple quick reminders before everyone goes off and has their lunch. And you know, I recommend tacos over hamburgers here in Texas, but you guys can eat whatever you feel like. But please follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Next week we'll be doing our webinar on malicious apps, and obviously there'll be even a little bit more detail coming in around this sort of thing. And with that, I would just like to thank everybody for your time. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to let us know. Use the contact us form on the site, or just shoot me an email directly, jt.keating@zimperium.com. Thank you all very much, and have yourself a great day.